Hello, greetings from Basel in Switzerland to all of you everywhere who hear and see these sermons. We're in a series of sermons on the book of Acts, and we've come to chapter 25, verse 13. In the last passage, Paul has been accused by the Jews who have plotted to murder him instead of giving him a fair trial more than once. And Festus, the governor, has asked Paul if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem to be tried, partly because that would get this difficult case off his hands and he wouldn't be responsible for any more. But Paul knows that he would be murdered if he went to Jerusalem, and so he appeals to Caesar. And one reason he appeals to Caesar is to escape being murdered by the Jewish government. And another reason is in order to get to Rome, because we read in Romans chapter 15, verses 24 to 28, that Paul thought that God had called him to Rome and to Spain. And so he wanted to go first to Rome and then to Spain. And this, appealing to Caesar, was a way to get to Rome and to begin this further missionary project. There is a tradition in the Christian church that Paul was beheaded in Rome. I frankly think that is very unlikely because of the legal brief that Luke is preparing here, and because of the fact that there was no evidence that Paul had committed any crime against Roman law. It was only the Jews who accused him of committing crimes against the Jewish culture and law and temple, but they had no evidence and no credible witnesses. So I think when Paul got to Rome and Theophilus received Luke's legal brief, that the case was either thrown out of court or he was declared innocent and worked in Rome and then went to Spain. But we don't have anyone recording these things. If he went to Spain, apparently Luke did not go with him. So beginning in verse 13, a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Now, Agrippa was Herod Agrippa II, and his father was Herod Agrippa I, and the family came from Cyprus. And I don't think we're sure if they were Jews or not, but they were the king under Rome of Judea and Galilee and the whole northern part of Palestine, which would have included Caesarea, which was the capital of the Roman province. So the new governor has come, Festus, and he's been to Jerusalem, and now he's back in Caesarea. And then in just a few days, the king goes to pay his respects because it is the governor and they need to have a contact with each other. And Bernice is not his wife. Bernice is his sister, who had a prominent position and came as part of the royal visit. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king, very possibly in private conversation. He said, "There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. So there is no trial by gossip. There is a face-to-face accusation and defense in front of witnesses and a judge." And we as Christians, I think, should take that very seriously, because in churches there is a very strong temptation to gossip and to have trial by gossip for people. And this is a very difficult question for pastors. If someone comes and says, "Oh, I think there's trouble here and that," a pastor cannot support the gossip, but the temptation is tremendous because we don't have to actually publicly confront someone when we might be mistaken. It's so easy to gossip, and we really have to resist that. When they came here with me, verse 17, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. We've already read that in the chapter before. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I expected. He expected crimes against Roman law that he would be appropriate to judge. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem to stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until he could be sent to Caesar. Now, when he says the emperor, he says Augustus, but it doesn't mean the Emperor Augustus. All of the emperors were called Augustus. The emperor at the time was Nero. Verse 22, Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself, because he is the king of Palestine, and he had the power and the right to appoint the high priest, the chief of the government of Israel, but he didn't live in Jerusalem. And so he wouldn't know everything that was going on in Jerusalem, and yet as king he was responsible for everything that was going on in Jerusalem. So he would have had an interest as the king and as a responsible person to hear from Paul about this controversy and what was going on. And then Festus replied, Tomorrow you will hear him. Verse 23, The next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. So it was quite a gathering, and a semi-official gathering, and a very social gathering, which Festus, as a wise governor, organized because he wanted the king and himself as the new governor, and the military officers and the local leaders of the Jewish society and the city in Caesarea to meet each other and become acquainted with each other. So the military officers were most likely not Jews, they were Romans, but some of the prominent men of the city would have been Jews, even perhaps the majority of them. So it would have been mixed, mostly Gentiles, but quite a few Jews in the room. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and he's going to present this to Agrippa, and he's going to turn the meeting over to Agrippa and put Agrippa as king in charge of the investigation and the discussion. King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. You notice he says shouting and not reasoning. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, to Augustus, Nero, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to His Majesty. The term he uses is the Lord. That's translated His Majesty, about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, not a trial, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. it isn't only unreasonable, it would have been illegal, and it would have been a terrible thing for him to do, and he would have been accused of incompetence and possibly recalled to Rome as a bad governor. He had to do that. In the beginning of chapter 26, verse 1, then Agrippa, who was in charge at that point, said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. Now, in the whole Greek world, which included Rome, if someone wanted to address an audience, they made a typical motion with one hand to call attention to themselves, to quiet the crowd, and to announce they are going to make a speech. It would have been a bit clumsy because Paul was in chains, and so he would have had to gesture with both hands, I suppose. He began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted or expert with all the Jewish customs and controversies. And this would have been true because whether Agrippa was a Jew or not, he was the king over the Jewish province and would have investigated and found out as much as he could about the history, the culture, the political factions of the Jews, and how it operated so that he could govern. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. The Jewish people all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, because he came from a prominent family and he was known. From the beginning of my life in my country, he was born in Turkey, in Tarsus, and also in Jerusalem, where he studied under Gamaliel and was in the government as a lawyer. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I am on trial today. So God had promised through the Old Testament resurrection, and there have been various examples of it. And the Pharisees believed clearly in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead or that he was the Messiah, but they believed that God had promised a Messiah and that he would come, and that in connection with the coming of the Messiah, there would be resurrection of the dead. Now, as it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors, the resurrection, that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. King Agrippa, it is because of this hope that these Jews are accusing me. Now you notice he hasn't said what the hope is yet. He's saying God has promised, and that it's because of this hope that the Jews, meaning mostly the Sadducees and the priests, are accusing me. And then in verse 8, where we'll stop, he turns to the Jews in the audience, and he says, "Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead?" Because they had in the Old Testament examples of the raising of the dead, particularly in the time of Elijah, where he raised the son of the Shunammite woman and another widow whose son he raised. And this was in the scripture and common knowledge that there was the raising of the dead. And so Paul wants to know, why would any of you doubt that the dead are raised and that we will see God's promise of the resurrection of the dead? Now, Paul is giving his defense or his testimony, and as we go on next time in chapter 26, we'll read he gives his testimony in a sense that we're used to the history of his life and how he met the Lord and how he became a Christian. But he does something here that I think we need to take seriously and include in how we give our testimony and relate to people. He doesn't only talk about himself, he includes and engages the audience by asking questions and inviting them to think with him and to engage with him. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? This is a way not only of giving a testimony about me, but of loving the people that I give my testimony to. So we'll stop there, and then we'll continue next time with the rest of Paul's testimony. God bless you. Amen.